So when most people use the words Bloody Sunday, your mind is drawn towards Russia in the 1900s, early 1900s, or maybe Ireland during the Troubles in the 70s. What if I was to tell you that the very first Bloody Sunday suspiciously took place in the streets of London, in and around Trafalgar Square, which saw much violence between the authorities and socialist factions such as the SDF, led by Henry Hyndman? What if I told you that there's characters in this story which capitalised massively from the Industrial Revolution that survived to this day, much like their properties as socialist shrines and socialist heroes, but were in fact capitalising heavily off capitalism itself? Like I said, this story has been very much hidden. It's almost suspicious that the other Bloody Sundays were named what they were after this date. This is the story of not just the foundation of some of the socialism that you know today, but the foundation of today's political parties in Great Britain. This is the story of the real Bloody Sunday.
In 1887, violent clashes rained out in the streets of London between the authorities and socialist and anarchist groups, which came to a head in Trafalgar Square and its surrounding streets on an event known as Bloody Sunday. The clashes that took place were between the Conservative government and socialist and anarchist groups such as the Socialist Democratic Federation, the SDF, which was led and founded by a man named Henry Hyndman.
Behind me is the house of Henry Hyndman. Henry Myers Hyndman was a conservative British writer and politician. He was said to have been swayed into socialism by Karl Marx and his manifesto. He launched the British first left-wing political party, the Democratic Federation, later known as the Social Democratic Federation, in 1881. Now, on the Irish question on Bloody Sunday, it was organised in aid of the release of an Irish Member of Parliament who ran the Irish National League, named William O'Brien. It was over his arrest in Ireland for raising up to 8,000 people who were refusing to pay their rent. He was a supporter of home rule in Ireland. However, Hyndman was not. He was, however, not in favour of the strict clampdowns and laws that came about as a result of the arrest of William O'Brien in Ireland. And these laws spilled over into Great Britain. So you had this conflict of interest. You had Hyndman, who was pro-British rule, and then you had William O'Brien, who was pro-Irish rule, but yet they were both fighting for the same socialist cause. So, Hyndman was a friend and disciple to many a Jewish socialist, including Karl Marx. He states how much he admires Jewish socialists of the time, yet he is described as an anti-Semite, etc. Hyndman himself may well have been discredited for his attitude towards British rule in Ireland. And it just seems strange to me that unlike the likes of William Morris or even Eleanor, never mind Karl Marx, despite being the very first man to found a socialist or Marxist party in Great Britain, it seems very much underappreciated and undervalued, and dare I say, a little bit hidden. So before the likes of Hyndman, socialism was actually dominated by foreign emigres, foreign nationals who were either on the run from their own country, you know, or they were coming here to deliberately influence British politics. Much like the German radicals who would use the Rose Street Club, which is just behind me, this building right here, which has changed very much in recent history. The organisation itself was a unison between the Blue Post and the German Communist Workers' Education Union. This event, or this establishment, shall we say, would host meetings from the likes of the O'Brienites or Oberknights, however you want to pronounce them, Jack Williams, Franz Kitz and Johann Most. Johann Most actually was sentenced to prison in 1881, I think it was, for trying to organise the assassination of foreign monarchs. But very, very importantly about this location is that it had its own magazine called Freiheit. And bear in mind that this building has been here for a very long time, and it was only ended in the 1950s, which would mean that this socialist community centre, if you like, was living through the First and through the Second World War. This is clearly a very famous and important place to far left militants.
This is Johann Most. He is said to have been responsible for taking the Rose Street Club from holding a traditionally radical position on the left side of politics to an anarchist stance in June 1881. Most had expressed his delight in Freiheit over the assassination of Alexander II of Russia, and advocated its emulation. For this he was imprisoned by the British government for a short time. Before being exiled from Germany, Most wrote a summary of Karl Marx's Das Kapital in 1873 at the request of Liebknecht. Marx and Friedrich Engels made corrections personally to Most's texts for the second edition, which was published in 1876. Most had been repeatedly arrested for his attacks on patriotism and nationalism and his advocation of violence in order to achieve his goals. He was forced to leave France just like he was forced to leave Germany in 1878 and settled himself in London, where he then founded the radical magazine Freiheit. Upon his release from prison in 1882, he then moved again to the United States to continue his anarchist pursuits, advocating for regimes such as collectivist anarchism and anarchist communism. Pictured here are Johann Most's two sons, one named John Jr. and the other named Lucifer.
Now this may look like a rotten alley with an unimpressive sort of demeanour, but what this really is the building where the SDF was formed. And during the 1800s, this would have been a very, very busy place, with very dangerous leftists, militant leftists walking about and planning. And dare I say, many of the decisions that would have led up to the battles and what went on in Bloody Sunday probably went on in there or places just like it. Something very interesting about Heinemann, leader of the SDF, was some of the company he kept. Which brings me to the beautiful Grosvenor Square in London, a very affluent, expensive area. Surrounding me are world embassies. Just to my right is the Italian embassy, and we'll pan out here now and look at this beautiful square, roughly where we are. As I said, affluent, expensive, beautiful area. Used to have lots of residences scattered about it, especially one which we're going to have a look at right now, which is this one here behind me with scaffold on it. That's the building that brings us here. One of the friends of Heinemann was Lord Randolph Churchill, father to Sir Winston Churchill. Very interesting man. Described by some of his friends in some captions as a socialist, but he was a Tory Member of Parliament. The same Tory Member of Parliament which helped form a subgroup, a group within a group of the Tories, which was dedicated to the foundation of Israel. This group had the likes of Balfour himself, which you'll recognise the name from the Balfour Declaration. It had Wolfe, a very influential parliamentarian at the time. Now, something else that people might not be aware of about Randolph are the rumours about his wife,
Jenny?
mother to Winston Churchill. Rumour has it she was a bit loose. Rumour has it she used to sleep around with influential men. One of these influential men just so happened, apparently, to be King Edward VII, grandfather to King Edward VIII, the abdicated, disgraced king in the lead up to the Second World War. If you was to be a conspiracy theorist and you was to look at an image of Winston Churchill in his youth around the same age as Edward, King Edward VIII, around the same age, if you was to, you know, really let your imagination run away with you, you would say that they look very much related. So when you look at the lead up to World War II, and you look at this resentment Churchill has for the king, maybe there's more going on here than meets the eye. Who knows? Just allegations. Maybe we're looking at a true family feud here, not just a parliamentarian against a monarch. So here we are, number 50. This is where Randolph lived. A little bit of an anticlimax though. Though it's a beautiful area, very expensive area. Massive anticlimax if you were to compare it with Blenheim Palace. Now, Blenheim Palace was gifted to Randolph's predecessor, John Churchill, for pushing back King Louis in a great battle where King Louis was trying to keep Catholicism alive in Europe. It was in aid of what you know as a Protestant regime, basically. So, John Churchill, ancestor to Randolph Churchill and Winston Churchill, went to war with France, King Louis, known as this narcissistic, evil world leader. And for beating him in battle, he was gifted this humongous palace called Blenheim Palace, beautiful property where Winston Churchill was born. The locks of his hair are left directly above the bed in which he was said to have been born. It's the palace where he claims to have gained all of his outer body experience and worldly experience to take on the Germans in the Second World War. It's where he studied the portraits and scriptures of his ancestor John, and he wound up writing biographies on him. So we can see he certainly saw his predecessor in a very Grandesque style fashion, and as would Randolph. Churchill, when it came time to shine in the 30s and 40s, said that it was Blenheim Palace and his ancestors that gave him the strength to sit outside of himself and to take on the Germans of the 30s and 40s.
Henry Hyman would meet Randolph Churchill, as we can see in this written account from Hyman's The Record of an Adventurous Life, chapter 25. I used not unfrequently to meet Randolph Churchill, and it is rather strange that, having known well 3 of the members of the so-called Fourth Party, Sir John Gorst, Sir Henry Drummond Wolfe, and Lord Randolph Churchill, I should never have met, nor, so far as I know, have seen Mr. Arthur Balfour. Lord Randolph Churchill's sudden rise to fame and power was one of the most dramatic political incidents in modern times. Later in the chapter, Hyman goes on to say, but quite apart from all this, to a large extent, assumed arrogance, Lord Randolph breathed a new spirit into the Conservatives, roused a genuine democratic and progressive spirit in the ranks of his party, and, in my opinion, had his health and nerves been equal to his intellectual vigour and capacity, it is within the bounds of possibility that he might have broken down the capitalist prejudices of his own faction and have entered peacefully upon the path of social regeneration.
person involved in Bloody Sunday, more importantly involved in socialism as a whole in the 1800s and still today, was William Morris, who nowadays people might recognise the William Morris Society, something which preserves his architecture, the architecture of his friends, and his artwork. Behind me is the house that he spent the last few years of his life. He previously lived in his family home. He was born into a family home in Walthamstow, which is a beautiful home, which has since been made a gallery to his work and very much preserved in an area which, by the way, is downtrodden, in a place where, for some strange reason, this socialist shrine has been preserved well above the living conditions of the people living there today. So let's just have a quick look over here. You can see where it says, follow me please. Here we are at the William Morris Society. We've got a nice quote from here. Guests and neighbours, on the site of this great hall once stood the lecture room of the Hammersmith Socialists. Drink a glass to the memory. May 1962. William Morris. So one of the famous quotes that come from Morris was, the real tyrants, the real arrogant, evil people of society were the landlords and the capitalists. But I find that a little bit ironic, considering he was born into a very wealthy family of landowners, and he himself created a company called, in I think it was 1861, Morris Marshall Faulkner and Company, and lived in properties such as this. Leftists give him this huge sense of entitlement. They credit him for being the first man to think of the worker, the conditions of the worker in the workplace, to try and bring a better way of life to the working class individual, so that they could see an aspiration to find their way out of the lower means of society and join this higher echelon. But it was truly a farce. The company in which that he had set up with other avid leftists and socialists only served to create textiles, art, lamps, etc. for wealthy Victorian families. So the stunning Kelmscott house here is not the only property that Mr. William Super Socialist Morris lived in. He also lived in a beautiful house called the Red House in Kent, which he moved to. He had built when he left his family home alongside one of his architect friends, which to this day is very well preserved. It's got a nice little plaque outside. Much like this building behind me is very well preserved, much like many socialist and leftist shrines are around the UK. He himself joined the SDF in 1883, which shows that he had plenty of time to gain influence and to put his ideas into the minds of the people that were going to take part in the battles, or the battle of 1887.
William Morris had been given credit for being a wonderful artist and a promoter of workers' rights, but his views and thoughts express a very different reality. He sold the idea of the abolishment of property whilst offering his workers free accommodation under his strict rules, limiting all they did from freedoms to food supplies. The reality of the Industrial Revolution was in fact a cruel one, which saw what we would only describe today as the normalization of child slavery and child cruelty in the workplace. This is a quotation from what's known as Correspondence, Communism and Anarchism from 1889, in the words of William Morris himself. Quote, Comrade H. Davis misunderstands my use of the word communist in supposing me to use it as the Owenites did as implying life in separate communities, whether those communities were mere scattered accidents amidst a capitalistic society or not, whereas I use it as a more accurate term for socialism as implying equality of condition and consequently abolition of private property. In this sense, of course, you could not live communistically until the present society of capitalism or contract is at an end. Equally, of course, the living in small communities is not in theory an essential of this great change, though I have little doubt that it would bring about such a way of living and abolish big cities, which, equally with Comrade Davis, I think much to be desired. William Morris didn't just concern himself with upper-class circles of socialism and wealth, but being a member of the SDF, he would often march on the streets with names such as Annie Besant and Eleanor Marx, showing his willingness to get involved at a street level. The question has to be asked, why would a man so wealthy, who's claiming to be offering such good things for the people, at the same time be leading them into violence?
Here we are at 7 Jews Walk, where Eleanor Marx spent the last few moments of her life. Jenny Julia Eleanor Marx was also known as Tussie to her family and was the 4th daughter of 6 children. She was credited with founding socialist feminism and described as a fearless activist by her admirers. Eleanor was said to have carried on the fight for international communism after the death of her father. She had shown early signs of interest in her father's teachings and socialism as a whole, spending time in her father's studies and translating and editing volumes of Das Kapital which he had not long been writing. She also edited his lectures and speeches, eventually working for him as a secretary of sorts when she became 16, which gave her the chance to travel with him to conferences and lectures around the world. Karl Marx would later disagree with Tussie's first partner, Prosper Oliver Lissengrave, a journalist who he agreed with, a participant of the Paris Commune, who had fled to London after the Commune suppression. Politically, Karl and Oliver saw eye to eye, but it was the age gap which bothered him, and by the time he had finally come to terms with the relationship, even approving of a book Oliver had written, Eleanor decides she's no longer interested and calls the whole thing off in 1882. Not long after this, Eleanor steps into the political world even further. In 1884, she joined the Socialist Democratic Federation, the SDF, led by Heinemann, and was elected as its executive. Whilst working within the SDF, she met fellow fanatical leftist Edward Aveling, a faithless, a cruel and characterless individual, apparently, who she would spend the rest of her short life with. Eleanor and some others found themselves in a dispute within the SDF and decided to leave, thus founding their own rival organisation named the Socialist League, where its most prominent member and leading member, if you like, was fellow socialist and wealthy artist William Morris. Henry Heinemann was being accused of the most heinous of crimes, nationalism, allegedly disagreeing with the ideas of internationalism, and even accused of being dictatorial, of having a dictatorship-like regime. Eleanor became more and more active, helping with movements such as the Women's Trade Union League, and the Gas Workers Union, and Socialist Democratic Party of Germany. On the lead-up to Bloody Sunday itself, Eleanor, like other leading socialists, took an active role in the demonstrations organisation, with her name alone carrying huge weight and meaning to those in attendance. In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, she wrote a report on the brutal treatment of the women and the activists that were there, saying that women had been specifically targeted and giving a story to their plight. Eleanor had even witnessed the forming of the Independent Labour Party, founded by Keir Hardie in 1893, but found herself alongside Aveling returning to the SDF, just like other members of the Socialist League. So Eleanor's story is actually quite an upsetting one. It left a bad taste in the mouth of many a socialist that admire her to this day. Eleanor had been infatuated with Edward Aveling, but was horrified to discover he'd secretly married a young actress, to whom he intended to remain committed. The disloyalty and rejection tore her apart and sent her into deep depression. In his book, Further Reminiscences, Heinemann claims that Aveling had convinced her in her grief to agree to a suicide pact, in which he had no intention of following up on. It's said that at the age of 43, on the 31st of March in 1898, she had her maid sent to a chemist with a forged note, or a note at least, signed with the initials of Aveling, so that the chemist would think nothing of it. Sources say her requests were of chloroform and a small amount of hydrogen cyanide, known at the time as prussic acid, prussic acid, saying it was for her dog. Eleanor is said to have signed a receipt, or the receipt, for the poisons and the package, and had sent her maid, or someone had sent her maid, back to the chemist to return the receipt. The story then goes, Eleanor retired to her home, her room in her home, and wrote 2 short suicide notes. She got into bed and swallowed the poison, thus ending her political career and life. She died at her home at 7 Jews Walk in London, where a blue plaque has since been erected, although Aveling could not be blamed in any legal way for her death. He seemed to make no attempt to clear his name, and the socialist community saw him as responsible and held him in incredible contempt. Once she had been cremated, turns were taken in looking after her urn by the British Socialist Party and the Communist Party of Great Britain until 1956, when she was buried in the tomb of her father, Karl Marx, at Highgate Cemetery in London. The overall point being, the story of Karl Marx, the hidden story of Karl Marx's daughter, certainly a very, very interesting and depressing one.
Heinemann was said to have been extremely authoritarian, and eventually, at an SDF meeting on the 27th of December in 1884, the executive voted by a majority of 2 that it no longer had confidence in Heinemann. Heinemann refused to resign, causing some of the members, which included William Morris, Edward Aveling and Eleanor Marx, to leave the party, where they went on to form the Socialist League in 1885, which included Fabians, Christian Socialists and Anarchists. Alongside Aveling, Morris and Eleanor were names such as Ernest Belfort Bax, Sam Mainwarning, Tom Mann and the anarchist Annie Besant. Frederick Engels, being an enemy of Heinemann's, was delighted by the split, stating in a letter to Mr. Bernstein, a friend of his, in December 1884, "I have the satisfaction of having seen through the whole racket from the outset, correctly sized up all of the people concerned, and foretold what the end would be." But the glee of Engels wasn't enough to save the newly formed Socialist League, which had struggled to gain any traction since it had begun. After 6 months, the Socialist League had 8 branches with a mere 230 members. This demoralised Morris, who wrote this quote to a friend: "I am in low spirits about the prospects of our party. If I can dignify a little knot of men by such a word. You see, we are such a few, and hard as we work, we don't seem to pick up people."
One of the things that the Socialist Democratic Federation did, the SDF did, was to establish their own propaganda firms. The building behind me, which is now the Karl Marx Memorial Library, was once for their own printing presses, for them to push their own propaganda. This was made a memorial to Karl Marx, a library to Karl Marx, in about 1933, towards the lead up towards the Second World War. Now, allegedly, Lenin's desk has been kept in there, nicely preserved. Allegedly. You can go in there and see it, you can see these photos online. But even more interesting than that are the sort of people that are using this property today. As you can see from outside, it's very modest. Unlike in the past, there's nothing on the roof which would give away the fact this is a Marxist library. But what this is in 2020 isn't just a shrine to leftism. It's a meeting place and a lecture hall for far-end leftist parliamentarians and activists. Let me hear that. Look at this. Unfortunately, I can't get in. I know that you're all heartbroken and would have liked to see me pay my respects to Lenin's desk, but we'll pay our respects all the same to the International Brigade Memorial Trust. There's a nice fist there. Absolutely charming. Marx House Limited Registered Office. Come over here, cameraman. How interesting.
The Marx Memorial Library remains a sort of shrine to the communists of today, what with it having not only published papers by Heineman's SDF, with characters such as Morris, but also provided work for the founder of the Russian Communist Party and the former premier of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, who was to work in the building a few years after our story, but a few years before the Russian Revolution and the Bloody Sunday of St. Petersburg in 1905. The SDF had released a weekly newspaper named Justice, which Morris had written many articles for during the year of 1884. The paper had initially been edited by C.L. Fitzgerald, and then by the likes of Heineman, Henry Hyde Champion, Ernest Belford Bax, Henry Quelch, and Henry W. Lee. William Morris wasn't the only influential writer to take part. Other names Justice would publish were the likes of Edward Aveling, Thomas Kennedy, Alfred Russel Wallace, Robert Arch, and Peter Kropotkin. This property has certainly made its mark on London, and to this day still sees many leftists of high status use it for meetings and venues. Its propaganda existed through both of the world wars and even helped Lenin gain his own eternal place within the city. He would edit the underground Russian revolutionary paper Iskra, or Spark in English, from his office, which had been gifted to him by Harry Quelch, the editor of the British Socialist Democratic Weekly, Justice. While entire countries and humanity as a whole suffered at the hands of communism, this property stood strong and is still permitted to stand strong today. The Soviet Union was tearing the world apart, and countries such as Armenia, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and others. It was free to reign in the Eastern Bloc countries of East Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Romania, Slovakia, and Poland, as well as African countries and much of the Balkans. What sort of a conservative government, what sort of a military advisor to a conservative government or a Western country would allow such an important beacon of communist and anarchist propaganda and anti-Western hatred to exist within its realm?
So, during the period of these early socialist demonstrations, the Metropolitan Police was governed by Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren. Warren was an ex-British Army officer with an archaeologist's career and a huge history in military experience. He had been commanding in the military when he was recalled in 1886 to reorganise the London Police Force as Chief Commissioner. He'd witnessed a similar outbreak of public violence by the very same groups only a year before in an event called Black Monday, in which Heineman's Marxist Socialist Democratic Federation had held a counter-demonstration against the Fair Trade League, which was a type of Tory-style group of the time. The Fair Trade League was in aid of creating protectionist measures to protect British jobs, whilst the SDF argued for the, quote, right to work. On Black Monday, an estimated 10,000 people marched on Hyde Park to hold a meeting, but this meeting became a travelling mob intent on looting and rioting in places such as St James Street, Stanhope Gate, Dean Street, and so on. The marchers seemed more interested in attacking upper-class properties than they were in meeting the people they had originally claimed to be protesting, though alleged clashes were said to have happened at a conservative club. This would be one of the leading reasons Warren placed a ban on the demonstration on Trafalgar Square when hearing about the upcoming march planned by the SDF, an order in which the Socialists had no intention of following. Warren would later be scapegoated for the events of Bloody Sunday, or at least it would appear that way, despite him being a liberal having many high-end connections. One contributor may have been his argumentative or bad relationship with the likes of Conservative Home Secretary Henry Matthews or the Permanent Home Office Secretary Godfrey Lushington. Warren's extravagant uniform was plastered in the press as a point of disdain. They even mentioned his concern for quality of men's boots, which, if you ask me, is something that most military personnel would concern them with. An interesting fact about Warren was the blame he took for being unable to find the famous murderer of the 1800s we all know as Jack the Ripper. He was accused of assigning too few investigators and favouring ununiformed constables instead of undercover police. Even as recently as 2015, he fell victim to this accusation when Bruce Robinson labelled him as a lousy police officer or a lousy cop and said it was a Masonic conspiracy or some sort of government cover-up. Funny thing about Warren is he's not most famous for his part in Bloody Sunday or being police commissioner or so much his military career, but it was for the books that he published on Palestine, books such as The Recovery of Jerusalem, The Survey of Western Palestine, which may be why he even had a daughter born in Palestine, which stayed there for most of their life. At this time, demonstrations by the unemployed and radicals were commonplace, and some would sleep in Trafalgar Square and even wash in the square's water fountains in an effort to pressure the government on the issue of Irish Home Rule by gaining sympathy via public attention. The police responded after pressure from the press, which would often lead to violence, giving the radicals exactly what they wanted. The ban would bring those together who may not have necessarily got on in the socialist world, but felt the ban either affected them or was the perfect excuse for a riot. So, despite Warren's ban, the protesters marched in from places such as Deptford and Battersea. William Morris was leading the Clerkenwell crowd alongside Annie Besant, a fanatical feminist, Wiccan and anarchist, showing even wealthy land-owning artists were not shy of violent street activism alongside their grassroots cohorts. As a result, the police prepared for violence as people amassed under the cause of exclusive of freeing William O'Brien whilst advocating socialism. The Australian paper, the Inquirer and Commercial News, reported years later that for some strange reason, Warren had turned down a high-capacity water cannon to use as riot control, which would have certainly saved many casualties in which his men faced. The police began to place officers in preparation from 9 AM, whose numbers grew to 1,300, who by 1 AM were all firmly in place. It's said that Warren had his men in rows of 100 stood along the sides of the square and rows of 120 in single file in the centre. So if you can imagine, because the place is very similar as it would have been, all along the sides there, all along the sides behind you would have been rows of 100 men, and in the centre about 120. It's said that 2,500 is the reported number of officers that have been placed around the square in various locations on foot and on mounted horseback. But if you was to believe William Morris, then it would certainly be something different. The numbers present among the marchers that amassed was said to be 20,000. But if you was to listen to William Morris, you would believe it was 100,000 socialists and unemployed people who were in attendance all at once, who literally came heavily armed with an array of weapons, hammers, knives, etc. Which would probably be why he explained it as a bit of an embarrassment, as a loss. So there's certainly a non-truth going on here. So, violence had already been occurring in surrounding locations such as Westminster Bridge, the Strand, Covent Garden and more, with both sides receiving heavy casualties. The SDF, the London Patriotic Club and the Irish Home Rule Union had decided together to gather for speeches from the likes of Morris and Aveling, which began a march accompanied by red banners and bands, but was disturbed and split up by police, mounted police on horses. Superintendent Dunlop of the A Division gave the order to disperse the crowd, and the meetings, which looked very much like rallying points for the growing numbers, which began to take shape on London streets. With batons drawn and with mounted constables, authorities split and disarmed the crowds, who put up a savage resistance, with all from sticks to iron pokers and knives. Similar clashes were occurring in places such as Haymarket, where police and socialist rioters were going head to head, and trophies were being taken by the authorities, which were later taken back to Scotland Yard. The Strand hosted many a violent scene, with consistent back and forth between radicals and police, who kept them at bay by dispersing them in short spurts. But eventually, horseback or whatever method they used, the crowd became far too much to cope with. The shops and properties of the area fell victim also, as the stones and bricks being used on the officers were also being used on the windows and buildings around us now. It was from the Strand entrance to the square, just before 4 PM, when Cunningham Graham MP and John Burns, the well-known socialist, were both arrested, which only antagonised the crowd further, which they had announced they had intended to challenge Warren on the legalities of his ban. But instead, they had decided to have a charged attack at the police, which resulted in their arrest and the rage of the mob. At 4 o'clock, the first attempt to invade the square from the SDF and its affiliated groups was made, where inevitable violence began between officers and the socialist mob. At this point, the first lifeguards were called out as a response to the level of violence occurring due to the mob's savage nature. The battle had raged until now, but the growing presence of the military seemed to stop the outburst of violence as they encircled the police amid cheers from one side, hissing and hatred from the other. Their mere presence was enough to push back the mob that moments previously had sought blood and seemed to be preparing for a full push towards Whitehall. The Grenadier Guards, having approached with their rifles on their shoulders, clearly sent a very obvious message to the onlooking mob, who had already injured many police. After a short stand and many verbal arguments, the defeated Socialists left the area, which eventually became calm. And it's said that by 6 o'clock there was no longer a threat in the area whatsoever, which once again is probably why Morris and other leftists saw this as a very embarrassing defeat.
Much like today, the media of the time gave its own representation of the day's events. Much like the countless socialist and anarchist articles up to today that describe the day as being one of a peaceful protest attacked by violent police officers. Members of Heineman's SDF were also members of another very interesting organisation, which was present or responsible for the political parties in which we know today and many of the socialist aspects we see in modern society. The Fabian Society was named after the ancient Roman general Fabius Maximus, who fought a slow, drawn-out war with Hannibal's invading army due to its numbers being too high to defeat in open battle. His tactics of delay are the ethos of the Fabian Society, who believe in achieving their goals through influence in business and media, unlike others who would see socialism take control all at once. It follows this strategy in the way of spreading socialism via the institutions such as entertainment and education, in what is known as the approach of the long march through the institutions. Something that skips many a history lesson is the Fabians' use of the term eugenics, which is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as the following. Eugenics, noun. The study of methods to improve the mental and physical characteristics of the human race by choosing who may become parents. Eugenics is to strive towards the deliberate manipulation of the planet's human population by excluding entire groups who are judged to be inferior or superior. The Fabian Society members advocated the idea of a society planned by science, and even supported the controversial idea of eugenics by way of sterilisation. Modern day leftists and journalists sometimes condemn this, such as an article in the far left paper The Guardian, written by Jonathan Friedland, called Eugenics, the skeleton that rattles the loudest in the left's closet. The strangest thing about this is that these far left socialists who were spouting these ideas were doing so before the likes of Hitler had taken power, and to this day the very same institutions sympathetic or in direct correspondence with the Fabian Society would have us believe these ideas began with Hitler's Germany, when in fact the term goes way back past any of our stories to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and had not reached Britain until the likes of the scholar Sir Francis Galton in 1883 in his book Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development. Its first coat of arms were very telling of the organisation's real nature, one being the logo, "When I strike hard," and the other an ominous shield of a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Fabian Society has since decided to choose a more appealing logo as opposed to the charming wolf in sheep's clothing. When we look at this stained glass window, designed by George Bernard Shaw in 1910, as a commemoration of the Fabian Society, we can see Sidney Webb and E.R. Peace reshaping the world to suit themselves, with various founders beneath praying to their own texts, which is a clear depiction of how they wished to shape the world to suit their own agenda. It has been founded by extreme radicals who were also members of the SDF and the Land Reform Union. They would arrange meetings between radicals which would include all from SDF members to the likes of the Oberknights. An important figure in the Fabians and friend to Eleanor Marx was George Bernard Shaw.
I don't want to punish anybody, but there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. Not in any unkind or personal spirit, but it must be evident to all of you. You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. And I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board, just as he might come before the income tax commissioners, and say every 5 years or every 7 years, just put him there and say, "Sir or Madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence?" If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social boat, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive.
He was also present on Bloody Sunday, alongside the likes of Annie Besant. And much like the socialist factions of the time, the Fabians went on to have a huge involvement in the political parties in which we know today.
So, in reflection, we can tell that this wasn't an organic event at all, but a suspicious pre-planned one, which was in fact a repeat of the smaller protests being carried out at the time. What this story tells us, and stories like it tell us, is how the political parties we know today were formed, how similar they really are. For instance, the Conservative Party was founded by the first Earl of Beaconsfield, a man named Benjamin Disraeli, who served as Prime Minister to the UK twice and was responsible for sending Sir Charles Warren to provide, quote, archaeological surroundings to Palestine during the establishment of the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1800s, and was actually interviewed by SDF founder Henry Hyman not long before his death in 1881. Now, the interview wasn't released until 30 years after it had taken place. But seeing as they are supposed to be polar opposite ends of the political spectrum, polar opposite ends of politics, what with Hyman being a leader of a socialist and Marxist party, the question has to be asked how these interviews ever took place, or more importantly, why it ever took place. Much like the foundation of today's Labour Party, whose opening conference was attended by characters of our own story, such as Edward Aveling and George Bernard Shaw, the Fabian, which may also explain why the party's founder was also a Fabian, and a trade unionist, whose name was James Keir Hardie, a Scottish nationalist. Those Fabians certainly seemed to get around, so I find the relationship between the likes of Henry Heinemann, the founder of the first Marxist and Socialist party in the UK, and the likes of Randolph Churchill, a well-connected Tory, to be as suspicious as it is interesting. A document was written by Heinemann discussing the meets that took place between the two, but despite these achievements and connections, that the Churchill family's name lived on, whilst Heinemann's almost seems cast to the shadows. But for such a forgotten, unheard of individual, Henry Heinemann, the SDF leader, certainly seems to have very high connections during his lifetime and even access to his opposition. The same leader had been responsible for the very violence on the streets of London, Great Britain, that characters like Disraeli were tasked with policing. Yet somehow the man himself evaded the police batons and cells, whilst many citizens of London suffered instead. The march itself had been a failure, seeing many a dramatic scene like that of Annie Besant, the Fabian anarchist SDF member, and personal friends of the likes of Morris and Heinemann, who deliberately tried to get herself arrested in an effort to gain publicity after giving a public speech. She offered herself for arrest, but the police that were on the scene kindly rejected her offer. By the end of London's Bloody Sunday, a reported 50 people were detained. Burns and Graham were in custody and 200 had received injuries. 160 went to prison in total, by some records, including Burns and Graham, who received 6 weeks in prison each, whilst Henry Heinemann seemed to have evaded any blame or punishment for the violent events and everything that had gone on. The most high profile case was a man named George Harrison, who was a stonemason who was accused of attempting to stab a police officer, to which he received 5 years in prison. The observation must be made that socialist violence, or violence in the name of Marxism, is nothing new, and something which has plagued the United Kingdom for a very long time. A process which repeats itself again and again. An almost identical event took place the following week, where a reported 40,000 attended the city once more, and a man by the name of Alfred Linnell was struck by a horse in a skirmish with police and lost his life as a result a fortnight later after the event. To this day, very little is known about this man, despite the sacrifice he made, much like many others, for the socialist or communist cause. Another important lesson to take from the riots of 1887 is the clear difference of opinion between influential factions of socialist leaders and socialists, despite supposedly all working towards the same goals. But I find this interesting point is overshadowed by the fact that all of the factions involved, who are said to be polar opposite ends of the political spectrum, seem to very much agree on not just political theory, but international intervention. So, this is it. This is Tower Hamlet Cemetery Park, Mile End. This is the final resting place of Alfred Linnell. Somewhere in this close vicinity, he's said to be buried, and the only reason we know that is because of a very unflattering tombstone which is directly behind me. This is the representation of the lack of importance of the communist worker in the eyes of the socialist leader. This is the grave of Alfred Linnell. So, Alfred Linnell, 1846 to 1887, the day he was killed by a horse, is
buried near this spot, so not on this spot. On Sunday the 13th of November 1887, 10,000 people marched towards Trafalgar Square, protesting against repression in Ireland and unemployment. Police and troops beat them back with truncheons. This is certainly very biased. A week later, Bloody Sunday, Alfred Linnell joined a gathering in Trafalgar Square. A week after Bloody Sunday, I do apologise. Alfred Linnell joined a gathering in Trafalgar Square. He was knocked down by the police horse and died on December the 2nd. Not one, nor thousands must they slay, but one and all, if they would dusk the day. William Morris. So this is the legacy that was left to him. He got a lovely little quote there from Morris, and a piddly little grave in Mile End. So without repeating the point, it certainly seems an anticlimax for someone who clearly gave up his life for the socialist cause.